In the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin wins a convincing victory with an overwhelming result of 82% of the vote. The remaining candidates occupy the following positions. Nikolai Kharitonov from the Communist Party to 3.89%. Vladislav Davenkov from the New People Party received 3.79% of the vote. Leonid Slutsky from the LDPR 2.97%. Western media are critical of voting in the presidential elections in Russia. Most of them noted the lack of intrigue. Vladimir Putin has no real rivals. The winner from the very beginning of the 2024 presidential elections in Russia was known in advance, since the main candidate, incumbent President Vladimir Putin, actually had no competitors. The presidential elections in Russia resembled horse races and were rather a predetermined referendum in the Soviet style. Other candidates could not really compete with the current president, since all of them are current members of the State Duma. Putin became the president of Russia for life. A bit of history. In 2000, Vladimir Putin was appointed the successor of President Boris Yeltsin. In 2008, he became prime minister under President Medvedev to return to the top post in 2014. The presidential term was extended to 6 years before the 2018 vote, and then in 2020, Putin changed the constitution again to reset the years of his term. At the moment, he may have at least 2 terms until 2036. Back in the distant peaceful times, Russian political scientists and experts came up with the so-called Problem 2024, in other words, the question of the transit of power after the powers of Putin's 4th presidential term were due to expire in March of that year. The main intrigue was how Vladimir Vladimirovich would be able to retain the reins of government of Russia. Several options were considered. First, the castling already tested in tandem with Dmitry Medvedev, in which the president and the prime minister simply switched places for 4 years. The terms of office of the head of state were extended to 6 years, and after Vladimir Putin returned back to his chair. This became possible only because the constitution of the Russian Federation did not prescribe a ban on holding the presidency for more than 2 consecutive terms, where the key word was the quoted word. Secondly, this option of the State Council was seriously considered, which was supposed to turn into a kind of supervisory superbody, in fact, into the 4th branch of government, standing above all others, which could be headed by Vladimir Putin in 2024. The only problem was that the State Council did not have a constitutional status until 2020, since at the time of the adoption of the Basic Law in 1993 it simply did not exist. Thirdly, it seemed promising to create not a virtual, but a real union state of Russia and Belarus, which could be headed by ex-President Vladimir Putin. But at first the father balked, and then the military operation in Ukraine went, to put it mildly, not quite according to plan, and there was no time for in-depth integration. Concrete steps to solve the problem 2024 were taken in 2020, when, during the adoption of amendments to the Constitution of the Russian Federation, on the one hand, the terms of Vladimir Putin's presidential powers were reset as if he had just entered big politics. On the other hand, the State Council was mentioned in the text of the Basic Law, which allows him to further expand his powers within the framework of ordinary federal law. As you can see, the choice fell on the option with zeroing. Why him specifically? Perhaps because you cannot enter the same river twice, as the experience of the former President Nursultan Nazarbayev and his successor Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has shown. The scenario of unification with Belarus has been shelved until better times. According to experts, by proposing amendments to the constitution in 2020, Vladimir Putin launched a process that got out of his control. The result will be the collapse of the constitutional consensus in the country and the destruction of the legal infrastructure of the succession of power. The adoption of an amendment allowing the current president to run for election in 2024 is a complex event, like a Matryoshka doll, inside which several projects of different people and groups are hidden at once. Moreover, none of these projects has been fully thought out. This is bad in itself, but the expert assessments that sound in this regard are almost worse. The key word of this expert disaster is multipass. The idea of a multipass is detrimental to expert culture in general, and in particular, to Russian chances for a long-term strategic analysis of the way out of the current state. An imaginary multipass scheme is being drawn inside the Putin system, which itself, in turn, is the product of a number of multipass. This is conspiracy theory that bit its own tail. The moment when everyone screams is disastrous for political science expertise. Now everything is clear. By saying that you understand everything, you deprive yourself of any, even weak, chance to get out of the situation. Realism is very important today. We need to see what really exists and what Russia will have to deal with further, and not morally evaluate and resent. Reality is more important than estimates. Did Putin have an authoritarian leader's plan, examples of which are known to us in many Central Asian countries, to perpetuate himself as president? This is an overly optimistic hypothesis. She assumes that Russia has a strong player, a strategist, the author of a multi-step plan, who controls the situation enough to implement it. The paradox is that neither a strategist nor a plan exists, and therefore the situation looks much more alarming. Having reached an impasse in his own management system, Vladimir Putin tried to break out of it, regain his freedom of hands. In secret, even from his own entourage, he prepared an improvisation on January 15, 2020. His statement at the time contained a completely different idea of amendments to the Constitution. However, that day he launched a process as Gorbachev had done, only in a different system, which he lost control of with each new step. A second version of the amendments appeared, radically different from the first, where ideological postulates came to the fore. And immediately after that, the current third edition was born, where these topics, which split society and the political class, were practically forgotten, although they remained in the text. And the main thing turned out to be the decision to reset the deadlines. The amendment proposed at a meeting of the State Duma by Valentina Tereshkova is very reminiscent of the famous joke about the Hasidic miser. This pious man found a purse on the street, but it was Saturday, and the rules forbade him to pick it up. And then the Hasid raised a prayer to the Lord and still took the purse. He asked God that there would still be Saturday everywhere around, but at this point in space it would be Thursday. A president who does not have the right to participate in elections, but has the right to do so as an exception, is very ridiculous. But it's also terrible, because it actually nullifies all other amendments. This norm is a manifesto of nihilism. If I want something, then it's possible. Thus, the constitutional consensus, the most important of the foundations of the Russian Federation, is abolished. For the previous 30 years, the country had existed within a constitutional consensus. Something is possible, something is impossible. Many laughed at the current constitution, offered another one instead of one, and even once shot for the sake of the constitution. But at the same time, by default, everyone agrees that the constitution exists and it is the constituent document of the state. People have different nationalities, different ways of life, different civilizations, but the Russian constitutional identity is the citizens of the Russian Federation, and this is not set by the government, but by the constitution. Now the constitutional consensus has been destroyed, and the reason for what happened is clear. This is a Putin myth. This myth led to a fixation on the topic of his departure. When will Putin leave? When will he leave? Within this myth, the question of presidential terms has been repeatedly raised. There was a problem in 2008, 2012, then 2018. Finally, the problem of 2024 appeared, which already looked purely mythological. These deadlines, which in reality have been violated many times, have turned into a basic calendar of passive politics. The viewer sitting in the hall is waiting for a magical date, when the problem that he does not solve will suddenly be solved by Putin's departure. However, the constitutional consensus has gone instead of Putin. In Putin's speech and in the speech of the political class, the concept of the overwhelming majority arose. This is not an electoral concept. This overwhelming majority does not need to be counted. Today it has returned in the form of an all-Russian vote, a plebiscite. Note that there is no plebiscite at all in Russian political culture as such. There have been periods of democracy, liberal eras, even periods of an independent court, albeit rarely and for a short time. But there have simply never been any state turns as a result of the plebiscite. Yeltsin's vote for the Constitution in December 1993 was an act of an armed victor, who won a minor civil war in the capital, and was perceived as such. However, at the same time, it retained the possibility of choice. Today's edicts leave no choice. Unfortunately, behind this conflict, people see a leader who loses the initiative, trying to keep it. The reasons why this happens can be discussed for a long time, but something else is sadder. As a result, we are losing even the partly ghostly state that we had. Russia is a state by consensus. It remains as long as everyone agrees that we are the Russian Federation and united by the Constitution. Today, this consensus has been undermined.